Thank you, everyone. My name is Kaitlyn Kalua. I'm the policy manager with the California Coastkeeper Alliance, which represents local waterkeeper organizations throughout the state. Most of my work is in Sacramento, primarily at the State Water Board. With that, I think I'll dive in, just keeping an eye on time. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as Eric mentioned, thank you, that we have Chris Brokate with Russian Riverkeeper, the clean team, as well as Sarah Hutmacher with San Diego River Park Foundation. We'll go through our presentations today. I'm going to go over just a very brief overview of statewide efforts on the issue of homelessness, those experiencing homelessness, and the trash generated by these camps, in individual encampments along rivers and streams in California, as well as then Chris and Sarah will dive into their specific programs kind of on opposite ends of the state in a way, looking at the Russian River in Sonoma County as well as down in San Diego. We do ask that everyone hold questions until the end. We'll have time set aside at the end for hopefully a good, robust Q&A, a little discussion. If you have burning questions that come up during presentations, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A or into the chat. That way we can either address them in the presentations or this way, you don't forget your question and it can be discussed at the end. Next slide, please. I want to start just a very brief overview to guide our conversation into the encampment challenge, quite frankly, is just starting with the State Water Board's trash policy, just very brief overview that I believe a lot of folks who are attending this webinar today are very aware. The trash amendments and trash policy were adopted by the State Water Board in 2015. That includes a compliance deadline essentially of 10 years after the amendments are incorporated into existing permits, essentially MS4 permits and others that I'll discuss in the next slide, with a backstop of a narrative yet enforceable water quality standard of there'd be no trash present by 2030. It's very ambitious and therefore very grateful for Eric and others who are engaging in the topic of, trash management and, quite frankly, the monitoring of said trash in our waterways. Next slide, please. So the coverage of the trash policy and the trash amendments, just as a brief reminder and overview, that involves municipal, Caltrans, essentially freeways, highways, industrial and construction sites, but that we're really seeing this primarily as a municipal MS4 stormwater permit, that under the MS4 there are these areas that must be covered under the permit. You're looking at high density land uses, any industrial, commercial, public transportation stations are all required as priority land use areas for the purpose of the trash policy to focus efforts and manage and capture trash in these areas. Additional areas could be identified within a permit and included in a trash management plan and covered by the permit. Currently this year, the Caltrans statewide permit is being updated. There's a lot of internal discussion of how Caltrans will address encampments along different highways and freeway corridors. We are waiting for the formal draft to come out. We're anticipating it to be released in the coming months. So that is something that is a development that will be taking place, as well as then industrial and construction statewide general permits. We're expecting an update of each of these to be released in the next year that both will include an outright prohibition of trash discharge along with the trash policy and trash amendments. One exemption I do want to flag is the LA area that is included in an existing LA trash TMDL. Essentially, that TMDL predates the trash amendments and therefore is the only program that's essentially exempted by the trash amendments, which in a large way were modeled after the LA trash TMDL. Next slide, please. Again, just a very brief overview that the core program of the trash amendments was a track 1, track 2 structure, in that those municipalities that fall under track 1, you're looking at full capture systems and devices to capture trash in our storm drains, as well as then track 2 is a full capture equivalency for areas that maybe does not make the most economic sense to install full capture devices. Allows for a combination of approaches, but does require monitoring. Next slide, please. Just a quick note on the compliance monitoring. Again, a big topic within this webinar series is how do we monitor for compliance? The trash amendments are, a huge development here in California, and so we're looking at, again, full capture in track 1, but then you're also looking at that full capture equivalency under track 2, two different requirements under the trash prohibition versus the receiving water water quality objective. That, again, demonstration that we're meeting that water quality standard of no trash present by 2030. Last month, I believe SFEI and OPC presented on their trash monitoring methods playbook and guidance that was released. So I personally look forward to going back to that webinar recording and learning more about the monitoring methods that are laid out in that playbook that can help with this compliance monitoring of the trash amendments. Next slide, please. And now we're getting to the heart of today's discussion and looking at trash generated within an MS4 system, and really importantly, those areas outside the MS4 that is discharges directly into a water body that don't necessarily go through an MS4 system. We're looking at high-use beaches, campgrounds, encampments that, quite frankly, exist outside the MS4, but are trash hotspots, and that they discharge directly into our waterways quite large amounts of trash. And how do we manage these spaces? Next slide, please. Just a reminder again that we are looking to meet that overarching water quality objective that there be no trash in our waterways by 2030. It's an audacious, quick, rapidly coming up goal. And I think I'm going to transition to the next slide, please. Just keep an eye on time. Emphasizing again trash hotspots, that examples are high-use beaches, regional parks, and encampments. So I'm going to briefly discuss a number of efforts to address and manage trash generated by those who are unhoused or experiencing homelessness. That in California, there's no denying the gravity of our housing crisis and those who remain unhoused, and unfortunately do live among, whether it be our streets, streams, waterways, who are individuals and they generate trash, and without proper services or services provided to them, have no place for their trash. And these does end up in our waterways. So I'm going to keep an eye on time. I really want to get to our other presenters. So next slide, please. At a glance, at the end of 2019, my organization, California Coastkeeper Alliance, conducted a very informal and qualitative survey of existing efforts and programs to address trash generated by homeless encampments. This was taken from a water quality perspective. We surveyed 5 different programs, primarily from an NGO perspective, to gain a sense of the structure of each program, the partnerships and entities involved, and the program results. Different strategies were evaluated that, to prevent and eradicate trash generated by encampments. They ranged, of course, efforts range from evictions to actually engaging the homeless individuals in maintaining and keeping a clean camp. These strategies can range from controlling the amount of trash generated, but fortunately, we do have to consider legal restrictions. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in 2018, I think many folks on this webinar are aware of the Martin v. Boise decision that ruled a city cannot criminalize or in some cases evict a homeless individual for sleeping on public property where there's no shelter or alternative space available. And so this is something we dove in to these existing programs into how is this approach? How is this addressed? How is this approached in different municipalities and counties statewide? Next slide, please. Key takeaways from this program include that individual program goals vary with very different definitions of success. For example, is success defined on the removal of trash? Is it the number of unhoused individuals engaged, the number of unhoused individuals that enter transitional or permanent housing, considering geographic and demographic differences that inform physical as well as political challenges in implementing programs? I'm going to quickly move on to that. You're going to hear today from 2 of the groups that were surveyed in this report, neither of which are social services organizations, and approach the issue of trash and homelessness from very different perspectives, but with the overarching perspective of achieving water quality and maintaining the health of our rivers. One program will be by Russian Riverkeeper's Clean Team, Chris Brokate, which that program engages unsheltered individuals to manage their own trash and to keep a clean camp by providing weekly trash pickup, as well as engagement and physical recruitment of individuals to participate in this program that then qualifies for transitional housing, as well as other services. The other program you'll hear from is San Diego River Park Foundation, which does take a much more data-driven approach. You'll learn about that shortly, to inform their volunteer cleanup efforts and to connect unhoused individuals with local services. Next slide, please. Very briefly, want to flag the work being done by the Water Quality Monitoring Council, the Trash Monitoring Working Group. There are 3 subcommittees listed here on this slide. Next slide, please. I, alongside Dahlia Fadil with the City of Rancho Cordova, are current co-chairs of the Homeless Encampment Subcommittee. We are having internal discussions as a subcommittee about rephrasing and renaming this subcommittee, but overarchingly, our goals are to provide data to the water boards to identify and quantify trash generated by encampments, and to share best practices and programs amongst the subcommittee members to manage and reduce trash that are generated by these encampments. Next slide, please. We are in the midst of conducting a trash survey. That is, the purpose is to identify who has what trash data on this issue. It's very data-driven, not necessarily trying to advocate for a certain regulatory approach, but again, trying to understand who has what data. Next slide, please. There are 2 parts to the survey. The first part was circulated in September of 2020. Again, trying to identify who has what data. This coming year, we're looking at the results of that, hoping to have a graduate student or another academic institution assist us in the more deep dive into the information, doing a more substantive survey for those who participate in part 1 to get a better sense of the actual details of their program. Next slide, please. I do want to move on to our next presenters. So if you'd like to learn more or participate in the Homeless Encampment Subcommittee, this is a complete ad hoc, all voluntary subcommittee. We welcome folks to learn more by visiting the mywaterquality.ca.gov, the Monitoring Council website. You can contact me directly if you'd like to be looped into the listserv. Happy to share more information. We hope to have a meeting in coming weeks to, again, share lessons learned, share ideas, share strategies, and set up our schedule for 2021. So thank you. And with that, I'll transition to Chris.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Brokate. I'm founder of Clean River Alliance and program director for the Russian Riverkeeper Clean Team. If you want to go to the next slide there. This picture here is the day that I decided, was inspired to start Clean River Alliance when I saw the amount of trash landing on our beach just outside of the mouth of the Russian River. This was in January of 2015. In 2015, just started going out on the river locally with some friends. And what we started to see immediately was a lot of the trash was coming from some of the homeless encampments along the base of the river and along the main stem of the river down in the lower part of the river in Guerneville. And soon after that, we just started to go in and engage the homeless and ask them if they would stage trash for us. And sure enough, we would coordinate another time to come out, and sure enough, they had staged trash for us. And the first year that we started collecting trash from the river and working with the homeless, we removed over 85,000 pounds of material. And in 2016, I officially launched a program, a weekly program for the homeless to stage trash for us, just like people with homes, to put out their trash on a certain day, organized by them, and we would collect the trash. And in 2016, we removed 160,000 pounds of material, not only with the help of the homeless, but also doing Adopt the Highways, creating public cleanup events throughout the watershed. And in 2018, I left my day job and started full-time with doing this, and with the support of Russian Riverkeeper, their fiscal sponsorship, in 2018. And since then, I've been able to go out and share our work. I was a keynote speaker in Southern California at a watershed event in for the Santa Ana watershed. also a keynote speaker on the American River Conference, and this is the second time that I've presented our project to the State Water Board, and I've also been on panels at the San Francisco Estuary Conference. And since then, we've been able to remove last year over 1 million pounds of material from our watershed, and that's largely in part of the relationship and the program that we've created with the homeless. Fast forward to now, 2020-21, we have twice weekly service now that extends over 75 miles in our watershed through multiple communities and cities. And we have twice weekly service, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And in February alone, we picked up over 16,000 pounds of material, 16,000 pounds material in 2 days alone, all in bags collected by the homeless. And that's generally picked up by one staff member. And we've never given them anything for it. They all do this because it's the right thing, and they're less likely to get harassed. And that's one of the things that we tell them, is that if they keep a clean camp, and they, the law enforcement and the community is less likely to get mad at them. And so I get asked a lot by the homeless if they can go to work for us, or how can they get a job doing what we do. And sometimes what happens is we'll show up and they'll be staging trash for us, and they'll ask us how much trash do they have to stage for us before they get one of our T-shirts. So that just goes to show you that that a lot of them really do care, and that they want to become part of the community again by getting involved and supporting what we do. And so let's see, we go on to the next slide, I think. So we have gotten a lot of support since then, and from our local county agencies, community groups. We also work with county parks to help mitigate the problems they have within the county park system around homeless encampments. And in one of the pictures here, you can see I'm actually talking to what doesn't work. And this is one of the situations where someone is hoarding a lot of trash. And literally my back is only about 20 yards from the bank of the river here. And that's part of the problem, is that each community has some of these individuals that are really making it bad, and on us and the others who are trying to collect trash and support what we're doing. Let's see here. You can see there's some budget figures there at the bottom. So we have gotten a lot of good support from our local agencies. And I'll just go on to the next slide there. So again, I mentioned that we have twice weekly trash service, and some of the things that have really worked for us are creating basic services at camps, trash service, porta potties, wash stations, outreach with service providers. Until there's enough housing, in Sonoma County, for instance, there's over 3,000 homeless folks, and usually only about 750 beds available to them during the winter, and very few permanent shelters available to them, considering the amounts of homelessness that we have. One of the other things that's working really well is creating an exit strategy for those who are asked to leave or are going into housing. We also found out, by doing the work, that some of the folks that we were working with or that were leaving stuff behind that were actually going into housing. So we've created partnerships with our local community service organizations that work with the homeless, and creating an exit strategy for those who want to leave a clean camp and work with us. They can get that checked off on their intake for housing, and that could go to a credit towards, a reference and or future jobs. And so also working with law enforcement really helps, communicating with service providers and problem camps, and noticing about evictions ahead of time so that we can respond to those problems, and actually having service providers respond out instead of law enforcement. Community service time would be really nice for those who don't clean up. So Not everybody participates in this program. I wish they did, but again, I think that in each community we have, a mental illness problem with hoarding, and it's those individuals that are making it really hard on us, stressing our budget, our resources, and the environment. And so there's, ways that we can involve the homeless to get involved with collecting the trash, just like I mentioned, with no incentives, but we could also be offering them a cash for trash program, creating clean team crews, working with the homeless, like the Downtown Streets team, for instance, a very successful group in the Bay Area. We have seen a dramatic decrease in the amount of trash on our beaches because of our program. I would say up to anywhere from 85 to 90% less trash winding up on our beaches outside of the mouth of the river. And some local groups have actually canceled Earth Day events and cleanup events because of that fact. We basically get more dollar for trash, picking up trash, than anybody can. We can save public works and law enforcement a lot of funding by intervening and creating these extra strategies and things that work. Let's see, you want to go to the next slide there. So just to jump over to COVID really quick, I wish I could say things got better, but they didn't. Things got worse during COVID. They were the last ones to receive a lot of sanitation into their camps. There were less bathrooms open. Bathrooms were closed in public places like parks, restaurants, and other places where they normally would go in and get, cleaned up and or fresh water. There was a lot less outreach, and there was a lot less places for them to get these services. For instance, up in Cloverdale, the one place that they were coming in to get services and our food once a week was closed during COVID. Also, crews stopped mitigating trash for over 4 months last year. We had probation department crews that were working in our waterways that absolutely stopped working for almost 4.5 months mitigating trash. So we have a massive accumulation of trash in our watershed currently that needs to be addressed. We continued our work during COVID by taking a lot of extra precautions. We upped our services to the homeless encampments. We included bringing water, masks, and sanitation out to the camps. And we worked with our local navigation center that actually became the winter shelter when it closed. We opened up a place where they could actually stay in the summer, COVID safe, and a place that they could hang out during the summer instead of going out in the watershed. Let's see, I think we can go on to the next slide. So that picture there is a project that we started in 2019. We modeled the program after the Downtown Streets team. We created our own clean team working with the local homeless. And you can see that trash in front of them there is the amount of trash that we picked up in 3 hours locally. So I want to talk about, let's see, next slide. Talk about what doesn't work. So this is a pretty dramatic picture. If you look really closely at that picture there's a guy sleeping on top of that pile of trash. And when I walked up to that scene, I actually thought he was dead. When I woke him up, his hand was bleeding, and he said that he had thought maybe a rat had chewed on his hand overnight. I thought that was really sad. But our policy of moving people around is a real problem for them and our environment. It makes it harder for service providers to stay in contact, and it makes it harder for them to go out and trust people for services. Hoarding with no consequence is a real problem. Like I was saying, each community has one, even people with homes. Each neighborhood may have that guy that doesn't mow his lawn or collects multiple cars in his front yard. And it's the same thing in the homeless community. There's a few bad individuals that are really making it hard for others. What's happening now, too, in our cities and along our watershed in some of our major cities where the homeless problem is and more extensive, we have no exit strategy in place and no way of cleaning up after some of the homeless encampments. We recently cleaned up a situation in Santa Rosa where we removed over 13,000 pounds of material that had been sitting out in our environment for decades. We need each community to start taking care of their own. We have communities in our watershed that have no services or no help for the homeless, and they're pushing the problem on the other communities. Our worst case scenario is in Santa Rosa right now. Because of they do provide services. We do have other communities that are pushing the problem into Santa Rosa, but we have service providers in that in Santa Rosa that aren't providing some of the services that are needed to keep people safe and in place and clean while they're out until there's enough housing. I think that's about what I got on that right now. So we'll leave our questions till the end, I think.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I think we can transition to Sarah. We're right on time. Thank you.
I tried to move that along fast as I could.
Well, thanks, everybody. My name is Sarah Hutmacher. I guess we'll move right into our case study on the San Diego River. I'm going to be focusing a lot on the intersectionality between homelessness and the San Diego River, like from the environment standpoint, because I think as are many of us, we're not homeless service providers or outreach specialists or have any special training in social work. So it's kind of an opportunity to evaluate what we do and where it overlaps and intersects with this bigger issue. So next slide, please. As I said, the River Park Foundation is a nonprofit. We do a lot of work in addition to reducing trash. We do habitat improvement, research projects, community engagement, youth education, land acquisition. So lots of different programs. But for many years, the trash program has been a big significant part of what we do. Next slide, please. Our trash management model is really based on our cleanup program, which started 20 years ago. And as we started doing cleanups, we identified the need for better data. So first, we do these site condition data collection activities. And then next, I think there's an advance, it'll click to the next picture. That helps us to do landowner coordination to make sure that we have the appropriate support and permission. And then next is the cleanup. So this process allows us to make sure that we have the right tools for the job. I've said this before, but it kind of helps us know if we need to bring a 40-hour dumpster or a pickup truck, or if we need to bring Girl Scouts or Marines to help with this cleanup effort. But it also helps us make sure that we're really efficient with our resource use, that we're not sending the wrong tools for the job. It helps make sure that we can engage the responsible parties, because in most cases, the River Park Foundation has no obligation to help with this cleanup. It's just part of our mission to help see the river be healthier. And then, of course, it helps with accountability. One more click, please. We do this over and over again, because after the cleanup, a lot of landowners will kind of wash their hands and say, hey, great news, we're done. And as you all know, this is an ongoing effort. So it helps us to make sure that we always close the loop. Next slide, please. So for many years, we collected data as a point in time count twice annually, but because homelessness and storm events, dumping are so dynamic, we really found that we needed to increase the surveys. So since 2016, we have started using this tool called Mappler, which allows us to do data visualization on this desktop version that is data collected using a smartphone app. Our staff and interns do all the quality assurance, but the data is citizen science, kind of with a lot of training, but still sort of a crowdsourced approach. The functionality of this tool lets us issue kind of variable permission logins so that some people can view only, some people can edit, and it lets us password protect some sensitive data, which is especially important when we're talking about data about homeless encampments. Each survey, the teams go out 2 to 4 times a week, and while they do this, that allows them to cover usually about a half mile, sometimes 2 or more miles, depending on how many acres each segment is and how far they're going to have to walk, how dense the vegetation is, and all that. When they cover all these different segments, they are walking about 24 miles of the lower San Diego River, and they our goal is to make sure that every area, every segment is surveyed no less frequently than monthly. Some of the more dynamic areas we survey more frequently, and some of the areas that aren't changing as much we survey less frequently. This informs cleanups that we do. We removed 300,000 pounds of trash a year through our cleanups, but also we share this data with the city of San Diego, with private landowners, with contractors that are being hired to do cleanups, and all of that helps us reduce the amount of trash in the riverbed. Next slide. So as a result of all this data collection, we found that one, we had extensive knowledge of the riverbed. We have robust relationships with all of the stakeholders, and we have a multi-year data set with locations of all the encampments that were happening. And with a little analysis, we could also look at recurrence of those sites, which sites were coming back all the time. And we found that just by virtue of being in the riverbed a lot, we had a relationship with some of the people experiencing homelessness in the riverbed. This picture shows each of those icons is a different homeless related data point. So, you can see in certain areas there are multiple locations and multiple access points. We really became active in trying to figure out this intersectionality because of some huge spikes in homelessness in the riverbed. In particular, San Diego hosted the All-Star Game in 2016, and that changed the enforcement that was happening downtown around the ballpark. And there was a big hepatitis A outbreak in 2017 that also changed sweeps and hygiene-related stuff on streets. And all of those things resulted in a huge spike in the number of encampments we saw in the riverbed. And we really found that if we weren't participating in elevating our knowledge that these encampments were changing and growing as a result of, other things happening in other parts of town, that there was a perception that people might think that these homeless encampments had been resolved when really they'd just been pushed into natural areas where they were having a humongous environmental impact on the river. So we started to say, how can we get our data to be part of this conversation? Next slide, please. So again, as I said, there's multiple issues, right? The first issue is the environmental impact. That has been our focus for a long time. All of the areas that we survey are downstream of MS4 capture devices. And, some portion of this may represent trash that evaded capture, but a huge percentage of it, like hundreds of thousands of pounds, is trash that was carried by people past those controls. So we estimate about 1 million pounds of trash enter the riverbed annually, and every year, depending on the year, we see between 74 and 95% of the trash that we are mapping in the riverbed is associated with encampments. So it's a huge, huge, huge factor for achieving a trash-free river, which is sort of the ecological issue. Next slide, please. The second issue, of course, is that there are 1 million different stakeholders. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but only by a little bit. There's every one of those green lines on the map is a different parcel. And each of those parcels has different ownership, different divisions in city. Even within the city, there's different land that control based on which division or department it's a part of. There's U.S. Postal Service, there's the Transit Authority, Caltrans, there's all kinds of different agencies, and many of those agencies rely on different law enforcement. Plus, there's different nonprofits, regulatory agencies, academic institutions, all kinds of different things that affect how those areas are managed. And, the obligations for this cleanup is on the permittees, which then goes based on municipal codes, usually to the landowner. But each of these groups has different resources available to manage this trash. I mean, we've got everything from huge developers to like churches and nonprofits that are trying to manage riverbed sections of their parcels, and with incredibly variable results. So an organization like the River Park Foundation that can kind of collect uniform data and help coordinate that effort can help increase efficiency. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there are people experiencing homelessness. So they're not only leaving trash behind, but they are affecting the perceptions of safety for people who are trying to use the river park or the river trail. They're really susceptible to the unsafe conditions from flooding and fire. vector-borne diseases. We've heard of cases of people dying of MRSA. And of course, in times of crisis like the Hep A or this pandemic, these people are really hard to reach and really hard to provide services. That camp in the middle ended up being an area that had been neglected as part of an ecological reserve and was neglected for so long that when we finally were able to do the cleanup, it was, I think there were 6 40-yard dumpsters, 2 truckloads of tires. It was just an insane amount of trash and just right along the edge of the water. San Diego, the Regional Task Force of the Homeless, has a most recent census says that there's almost 40,000 people experiencing homelessness in our area. And our census, that when we participate in that census, our most recent census was completed just a couple of weeks ago, and we mapped about 200 people living on the riverbed. So we're a piece of a puzzle for sure, but these unsheltered populations that are living in natural areas are especially susceptible to a lot of natural hazards, but also are contributing to a lot of environmental hazards as well. Next slide, please. So we started to look, as I said, to how do we take what we already do and try to find a partner who also already does something where we can work together. So we know the riverbed. We also have all this data. So one of the partnerships that we've been working on is with an organization that does case management and outreach to homeless folks to help connect them with resources and housing navigation. So for years, I had a hard time finding groups that wanted to do this work in the riverbed because they, were going to have to spend a half a day wandering around in a riverbed area where they didn't know the landowner, they didn't know if they had permission to be there, and they may or may not even connect with anybody. So by partnering with our teams, they're able to use our data to find those camps quickly, and in many cases actually go out with our team so that we can walk them right up to the encampments that we know about. And as I said, we had existing relationships that we've been able to forge with a lot of these groups so that we were able to say like, hey, so-and-so, this is an outreach worker. Can they talk to you for a little bit? And that helps overcome the hurdle of distrust with some of those organizations that they may not recognize. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is just pretty early. We started to pilot this in 2020, and the pandemic really made us kind of double our efforts because we really wanted to make sure that we could get connected with some of these folks. So unfortunately, 2020 was also really atypical because of enforcement changes related to the pandemic and also related to a lot of the social issues that were happening with protests and things like that drew enforcement out of the riverbed. It also decreased a lot of the landowner resources and management, and it canceled our cleanups. So the presence in the riverbed was really different in 2020. So it's a little bit of an atypical example. But during the pandemic, we were able to facilitate 294 contacts with folks experiencing homelessness and the outreach providers. Like Chris said, we also helped to collect donations for hand sanitizer and masks and gloves and things like that to help keep people safe, and socks and things to keep them warm. Those kind of things really help to build trust so that we can have a better opportunity to offer resources, including housing navigation. PATH did make 5 placements to get people out of the riverbed. Those were especially meaningful to me for spending time in the riverbed because those were folks that were seniors, people with disabilities. There was a woman who was 8 months pregnant. All of those people were people that were especially vulnerable and really, really interested. It was really heartwarming to see them get connected with the kind of resources that made them be in a much better place for, especially during a pandemic. And then, of course, this innovation attracted attention from media and elected officials. We've been able to do tours with our congresswoman and city council members. We've had a lot of buy-in from the mayor, and all of that attention and the kind of creative problem solving is great for increasing attention and ultimately, we hope, increasing some funding. Next slide, please. So I wanted to make sure I wrote a couple of these considerations down, and I'm going to go kind of quickly because I know that we're going to be running out of time. But I think that a few factors that we wanted to make sure that we factored in were this whole approach feels a lot more compassionate and humane for our staff and volunteers. So they're spending all this time in the riverbed seeing people that are suffering. I personally have encountered people who I needed to call 911 because they were having a medical emergency. All those kinds of things happen all the time. And I'm sure you guys have seen these things before. So this feels like a much more compassionate approach, which I just think it just wears less on our staff and volunteers to have this partnership. It addresses the root cause of some of the most significant trash that we see in the riverbed, which is great compared to just picking up the trash over and over and over again. I think the intersectionality is really important because it taps into funding, but focused on all sorts of different issues and potentially could increase funding availability. The partnership really allowed us to collaborate in a way that was really like central to our mission without getting us into the world of needing to consider whether we needed to train and hire people who had, experience in social work. Instead, we can just say, like, this is what we do. We do data. We do navigation in the riverbed. You guys do that, and we'll partner. And then, of course, there's some privacy concerns with making this data public. So we had to make sure that we were really informed about both what the laws are and also what the best practices are for being mindful of that. It's pretty expensive. I mean, PATH is the organization we've been working with most recently, and they can manage about 25 clients, like up to 25 clients per FTE. So, when you're talking about 200 people in the riverbed, it's potentially a lot of FTEs, but we've kind of geographically focused our area. So we're trying to make sure that we have the resources to do that and to make a meaningful impact in a small area, kind of prove the concept, and then we'll look into expanding it in the future. There's lots of confounding factors that make it difficult to track the trash impact directly. Of course, the pandemic is the one that comes to mind for all of us these days, but there's lots of other factors that make it a little bit difficult for us to show the return on investment from a trash standpoint. But that's an important thing we have to think about too. And then, of course, as we work on the main stem of the river, we don't know for sure how many of the folks that we are contacting might decide they want to move to a place where they're not going to get contacted and just move upstream or into a tributary or something where it would still impact our watershed, but be a little bit harder for us to access. But we are trying to make sure that that's something we're capturing so that we can quantify the impact there. Next slide. So in 2021, we're going to be increasing that to have a outreach worker join our team 4 days a week so that we can go cover more areas. Next slide. As I said, this is too soon to really have results, but our outreach partners are tracking the number of contacts, clients, and housing connections they make. And then we are tracking the number of encampments, which is this last slide here. I broke these into two different jurisdictions because for this partnership, we're focusing on the city of San Diego. So you can see a big spike around the time of the pandemic, and it's starting to normalize in the city of San Diego. Again, we track number of encampments, not the number of people, but that's something that the outreach workers are tracking. Next slide. And then, of course, we're tracking the amount of trash. So we saw, as I said, a big increase in trash during the pandemic, but we're starting to get a handle on it. But with cleanups so interrupted, that's still a pretty high number over the last couple of years. We're hoping to see that dip. I think that's my last slide. Yeah, that's my last slide, but there's my contact info in case anybody needs it. I guess I'll turn it back to you, Kaitlyn. Do you want to handle any questions or?
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. I'm turning on the camera now. No, I just think the work is so powerful. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the general attendees. If there's individual questions, thoughts, any deeper dives that folks would like to take.
You can unmute to ask your question. You can also send your questions in via the chat.
see. I can also pose a question too, since we've allocated the 10 minutes. So Chris and Sarah, I guess, you did such a great job of showing what has changed with COVID. I know that's a big question for folks, and the increase of precautions as well as what you're seeing in the river. So I think you both detailed that pretty well. But could you each speak to maybe a success of each of your programs? Or and that can be defined whatever example comes to your mind.
I like to gauge our success by the amount of bags we pick up every week. It just amazes me that it's almost that easy to go out and engage most of these folks just to put out trash. And when we show up and they're there, and they do the heavy lifting, they never ask for anything in exchange except for sometimes a T-shirt or, we usually offer some of our helpers, rewards. I purchased some propane for some of the folks that really help out a couple of months ago. And so I just kind of measure our success by the way they help us. And it's just something I wish everybody could see.
I mean, I would say that the biggest success that we have is that there's more participation across industries, that both landowners who might be motivated by complaints from their tenants or fines from the, violations that are issued by code enforcement, or potentially they actually care about the environment as well. But, there's lots of different motivations, but the outcomes can be the same if we're all working from the same information. So we've been able to see in the last few years, like more participation from landowners who actually have the obligation to do some of this work, more participation from the city, more participation from, the outreach providers, like all of those different groups. When you see all the cogs like working in sync, it can be a lot easier to not just feel like you're beating your head against the wall trying to pick up the same trash over and over and over again. I did see Beth's comment or question in the chat about the contributions. So we do different, we have 6 different sources of trash that we track: active encampments, inactive encampments, stormwater debris, dumping, and litter, and then special removal. So all of those different sources are things that our volunteers get trained to identify. And really, when we're looking at, when I say 75 to 94 or 74 to 95% is from encampments, that accounts for everything in the encampment category, everything in the inactive encampment category, 75% of our stormwater category, which is our estimate of how much of stormwater that we identify, which is things that got carried to their location by water, but we estimate about 75% of that originated in an upstream encampment, as well as a percentage of the dumping, because for us, dumping includes shopping carts. So when we add all of those data points together, that's how we get to 75 to 94%. And I did a presentation recently, which I can send to Eric, about like how we identify each of those categories, and that might be more useful for how we train everybody.
Be great. And then Chris, Sarah, and Eric, are we able to stay on a couple minutes past 12:30? We've got some great questions coming in the chat.
We can take as much time as we like.
Okay, let's plan on going just a couple minutes over. We won't keep everyone on too long, but there's some really great questions. So I'm going to go on. Peter asks, there, my chat was moving. Is there anything that the state could do or any legislation that would help? He's thinking of ways to reduce tires, mattresses, or other things that are illegally dumped. I'm going to make one point and then I'll turn to Sarah and Chris. I'll say statewide, we're looking at increasing NGO eligibility for funding of certain grants. That we are actively having conversations with specific offices about, I believe there's a grant under CalRecycle that we're very interested in ensuring that is open for NGO eligibility for those that are physically on the ground doing cleanups, who are, whether it be an NGO cleanup specific on a waterway or, again, more of this homeless engagement program side. And I mean, that takes so many different forms, as you saw with both Chris and Sarah's presentations. So that's one piece that we're actively looking is, again, increasing NGO eligibility for funding. Chris and Sarah, I'll turn it to you.
I mean, I think for me, the thing that comes to mind most is that it's really important that we reckon with the amount of trash that's originating outside of the MS4, that it's not like a small amount that's like blowing into the river past a storm drain. It's like, you know, in just our watershed, we're talking 1 million pounds. So it's a lot of trash that I think needs to be part of that conversation. And I think that's one thing that we've really focused on is just trying, if we have the data and we increase the quality of our data collection, that really helps us to contribute in a meaningful way to that conversation, so that we aren't just saying like, no, pay attention to us. It's like, here's the data, here's what we're seeing, here's where we're seeing it. That helps, you know, everybody.
I understood the question it was related to dumping in one way or another, but I think there's just no consequence around dumping, and this is not a homeless thing. We just recently cleaned up a massive dump in a tributary up in Ukiah, and I think it's just the mentality of some people that they're always going to be doing that, and I think we need some kind of trash monitoring, like in certain areas, hotspots like that, where there's actually cameras and some kind of consequence. But the other thing that I was going to make a point about the homeless as well. Forgot the point I was going to make about that. Sorry.
If it comes back, feel free to chime in.
Right.
As you remember. Michelle asks, have you communicated or worked with local elected officials to encourage housing options? So a little outside the scope of water quality, but again, everything's interconnected.
So I think I'll answer that we are not as experts in what kind of housing options make sense for the folks that we're talking to in the riverbed. What we have done though, in close coordination with elected officials and decision makers, is to make sure that the folks that are living in the riverbed are part of the conversation. So that means we have, previous to the River Park Foundation getting involved, the people living in the riverbed were not included in the homeless census that was done in our region through HUD. And it was in part because they didn't want to send volunteers like wandering through the riverbed. But our volunteers are comfortable with doing that at 5 o'clock in the morning. So we were able to make sure that those people are part of the conversation. We also have worked, like we've been working with this homeless outreach group to kind of ask more questions that, like, the River Park Foundation does not want to have people's first names and their social security numbers and birth dates and like how long they've been homeless. We don't want that data, but our homeless outreach provider partners can safely keep that data and provide some reporting that sort of says that can actually quantify and confirm our anecdotal experience that these folks are chronically homeless. Many of them have been homeless for a long time. Many of them have been in the riverbed for a really long time. And if we can kind of like confirm all that data, then we can make sure that that is part of the conversation with our local elected officials. Our most recent count, for example, had 4 times or as many vehicles, inhabited vehicles as the last 4 years combined. And there exists, safe parking. So that's something like we had meetings with our elected officials like this week, just to make sure that that's on their radar. Again, like our specialty isn't providing that housing or like connecting them, but we can make sure that everybody's working together.
I thought I would bring up a point I don't think we even addressed during this whole conference webinar, was where are they getting all of this trash? And that's something that we really need to consider, is controlling the source of the stuff that they're getting. And there's multiple, avenues and places where they're getting these things. And some of the times it's actually from the dumps or transfer stations that we have locally that have a lack of security, for instance, and massive amounts of stuff are coming from our transfer stations locally here. But also, available dumpsters, and that people are leaving things out from their homes for free. But I think a big percent of the stuff that we're seeing locally here is coming from our local transfer stations that don't have a lack of security, but they're all many other sources of where they're getting this stuff, even from service providers, the amount of stuff that maybe they're getting from in clothes and food and stuff like that, and the types of foods that they're getting in some of the campments, it just doesn't make sense even for them. They go like, why are we getting all these, things that need to be cooked, for instance, beans and, I don't see we see a lot of leftover beans and certain particular types of canned foods, for instance, that they just have no interest in. So I think there needs to be an avenue where we're controlling some of the sources that they're getting some of this stuff.
Thank you for that. Peter asks, just making sure I'm not lost here, are any of you using drones to map or identify encampments or trash areas? So I know, Sarah, you work within a very specific jurisdiction, physically walking the waterways. Chris, too, I'd be interested in learning more about how you inform, your targeted efforts and where you are in the riverbed.
I mean, I can say the short answer is no. The riverbed is incredibly vegetated. It's very dense, and a lot of the encampments, honestly, even from 20 feet away, it's hard to see where they are until you get in there. So the drones, I have heard of organizations using drones with infrared capabilities where they can actually look for like body heat to try to identify where places are, but we rely pretty much on the ground. There's another organization in San Diego that is trying out using those infrared drones, and I know the police department does the same thing with drones and helicopters, but we are not using that. We're primarily just walking the whole riverbed on the ground.
If somebody would like to donate a drone for us, we would love to have one. I got a friend of mine out one time to drone an area that we frequently walked. And I was surprised to find things by the air that we literally walked by. And like Sarah just said, since the vegetation is so thick, in some cases, you can literally be standing behind one and within 3 or 4 feet behind, blackberry thicket and or large bushes, there might be somebody dug in. So I've actually found the use of a drone to be, a time-saving thing that we yet have been able to afford or get into our arsenal.
Oh, thank you. Lucille asks, how does the org deal with liability of volunteers?
I think I understand that you're asking, like, how do we cover the organization from volunteers like being injured? I guess you might be also asking about like volunteers being kind of unpredictable as to how they interact with people maybe, but I can answer both of those things. We have a liability waiver that volunteers have to sign. It's mandatory for participation, and we explicitly say in the liability waiver that volunteers are expected to practice respect for members of the public, including people experiencing homelessness, and that, if they don't do that, then they won't be allowed to volunteer anymore. But a very small percentage of our volunteers have interacting with homeless as part of their role. Almost everyone that we work with, because we don't clean up active encampments, we're only targeting trash once it's been abandoned. The majority of people are only going to have incidental contact with people experiencing homelessness. That's another reason why our data is really useful. If we know there's an active encampment, we can intentionally keep volunteers away from an area where they might be like, they're either a perception that they're harassing somebody or where they might be in a position to like interact with somebody in an unsafe way. But I do think that the small percentage of volunteers that we have that do interact with homeless people as part of their job, they are almost always supervised by staff or a more experienced leader. So that person has been kind of trained in some de-escalation in case that becomes necessary. They have kind of a whole training that they have to go to if they are going to be interacting. But again, this is another benefit of having an outreach worker with us, is that our teams don't have to get good at that. We really can let the outreach worker take the lead on how to have those interactions with people. And then our folks who are attracted to our organization by, passion for the environment can focus on that. I hope that answers the question.
And from our end, we have been able to grow a pretty good group of core volunteers that don't mind doing certain types of work. But around homeless encampments, we don't try to organize or create community cleanups because of the liabilities and just the too many unknowns of who's coming out and what kind of intel they might be sharing on social media and stuff like that. So we're very careful about we call them clients or customers. We have a lot of clients and customers that we work with, and we've been able to build a lot of trust over the years. And that's the last thing we want to kind of interrupt is having other people come in and disturbing that balance. So it's tricky, but encouraging them to do that work that volunteers used to have to come in and to do is really what we're kind of looking for.
Peter asks, have you worked with franchise trash haulers? What is their role or the role of municipalities in adding services to franchise agreements?
So in some cases, we have worked with trash haulers in the sense that, we hire a lot of trash haulers for the purposes of disposal, but usually our volunteers are filling those dumpsters. As far as municipalities, we have had one of the municipalities in our area write into their franchise agreement that some funding goes to support our cleanup events. So in some case, that has been something we're just starting to do. That's a relatively new thing. We have several of the haulers that do donate services and things like that in an in-kind way for the work that we do.
In a perfect world, we would love to have more of the haulers picking up some of the stage trash for us along their current route. That would be ideal and more efficient.
Xenia asks, did you do any categorization of trash collected?
That's a great question. We've definitely, we do separate out recycling when we can, and we do separate e-waste and hazardous materials. That said, we don't do a whole lot of sorting beyond that. It's something we've been asked to do before, and in general, we're just talking about our average cleanup. Well, pre-COVID, our average cleanup was more than 2,500 pounds of trash at a time. So it's not usually feasible for us to spend the amount of time sorting beyond just getting the e-waste out of the waste stream and getting the hazardous waste out of the waste stream. But we have done some sorting as small projects where we're specifically wondering about the trash coming out of one channel, for example, and we'll do 100% collection and then sort it into categories. But when we're talking about 300,000 pounds of trash a year, it's just not feasible for us to do very much categorization beyond that.
I totally concur with what Sarah just said. We are in the same category. We remove over 300,000 pounds of material a year easily. I think that it's hard when there's that much trash still sitting out in the environment to even spend that time. I'm more concerned about really protecting and getting the masses out. And a lot of the stuff that we find is so soiled that it's not recyclable anymore under the current standards for recycling. So
most times,
we do a certain percent. We have volunteers that that's kind of their thing. They take it upon themselves and start to divert as much as they can, but it's really hard.
Because recycling has a value, a lot of times the folks that are living in those encampments have already sorted out recycling that has a exchange that they can get some they can turn in for money. So we don't find a ton of recycling. Really, we're separating out batteries. Occasionally we find like e-waste, like electronics and stereos and stuff like that. We find paint and chemicals and things that we do try to separate out from the waste stream. But yeah.
And with the lack of places to recycle material, we've seen an increase in the amount of trash since we had those CRV depositories like at our Safeway in our small town. So it's impossible for just about impossible for most of the folks out in this area to get to a recycling center like in Santa Rosa or Windsor, which is, far by bike or trying to walk.
We have a few minutes left here. Thank you, Eric. Announced that I have a couple more questions I think we can discuss briefly in the chat after I go through the following three, that if you have additional questions, please, contact us offline. I believe our contact information is on the website, but we can enter into the chat before we leave. Lauren notes that another nonprofit in Southern California County has a model where they offer trash bags and limited care packages to people experiencing homelessness and return the collected bags and trash a week later in exchange for new bags. Would this be a model that could benefit the river and add to the responsibility? As Chris's presentation mentions, before I hand it off, I'm actually going to flag that I believe that that program was actually modeled out of the Clean Team program that Chris created in the Russian River, and that it's one of the first that we know of statewide where you did have a weekly engagement and service provided to those experiencing homelessness and living along rivers by engaging, providing a trash bag, as simple as a tool as a trash bag, and then a consistent return time and date. So you're establishing that trust, establishing that consistency of saying, we are here, we see you, and we can take away your trash. So that said, I'll turn it over to Chris and Sarah.
I'll just say the first time that we did this, it was actually their idea back in the day when we showed up, and after loading the trash up that they had collected and the bags that we had left and everything else, the guy says, hey, can we get more trash bags and when can you come back? And that's what, he planted the seed that day. And I said, hey, here's some more bags and I'll come back next Thursday. And within a week, I just said, you know what, we're going to do this every week. And figured it out.
Yeah, I can say informally, our survey teams do carry trash bags, and they will often say, like, if we're going to have a cleanup in the area coming up, they'll say, like, yeah, feel free to use these trash bags and set out anything that you want us to take with us. But the challenge that we often have been faced with is that because so much of the river is privately owned or owned by entities that don't want to do anything that resembles enabling people to stay in that camp, there's been some pushback about the approach to kind of allow the camps to continue so long as they stay clean. And instead, which is part of why we have focused on instead trying to go to them, offer housing and try to figure out ways to get people out of the riverbed, because that's just more broadly supported by all of the landowners. I'm making a lot of generalizations when I say that, but we don't own hardly any of the riverbed where we work. So we're almost always working with willing landowners who want to participate in getting people connected with assistance and also getting trash off their property. Because when it really comes down to it, they will be fined if they don't maintain their property free and clear of trash per all the municipal codes. But I like the idea.
Final question, then I know there's a comment here. Where is the Department of Fish and Wildlife on the stream bed alteration for these activities? So I'm going to ask, to what level are either of you working with Fish and Wildlife? I know, Sarah, you did a great job showing kind of the jurisdictional and landowner differences and how there's so much overlay in both jurisdiction and landowner responsibility. So just curious to what engagement you have or may have with Fish and Wildlife.
So the Fish and Wildlife actually owns a preserve in the riverbed, so we have an opportunity to work with them both as a landowner and as an agency. But I think, as far as I know, that the homeless folks do not have any stream bed alteration permits for building their encampments in the riverbed. As far as the trash removal goes, I think that usually falls under maintenance. Activity, so that there is no project in terms of a stream bed alteration. So I think there's a lot of questions that you could dive into about, we see a huge co-occurrence between invasive plants and homeless encampments, and then you could start to actually get into things that may be considered a project. But as of now, trash removal is viewed as a maintenance activity.
I would love to say that we have a working relationship with Fish and Game, but they seem to be very stressed on time and staff to respond to certain situations. I think we need more, staff, and or they need to have somebody dedicated to just working the homelessness, because it seems to be a problem. We really need their support, because without backing from law enforcement or Fish and Game and other agencies who have more of an authority, we will continue to see this problem grow and be a problem.
Great, thank you. Just one final comment from Peter, just flagging that SFEI is using drones to map trash and litter and characterize it. There's a link dropped in the chat. I know that drones are part of the trash monitoring handbook that I believe Shelley and Tony Hale had described in the last webinar. I'm now dropping our emails in the chat, so we do encourage any follow-up collaboration questions. I do encourage anyone that participated in this webinar who's interested in engaging on this more to please join the Trash Monitoring Working Group subcommittee on this topic. We try to have quarterly meetings, and we'll be having one in about 2 weeks or so, so please do let me know if you'd like to participate. We really appreciate continuing these conversations.
Count me in, Kaitlyn.
All right.
Thank you, Kaitlyn, for organizing this webinar. Thank you for your presentations, Chris and Sarah. And Sarah, you're going to be giving a presentation later during this series. Really looking forward to that one. So I hope people that are online will go and get that information and join us for that special presentation. I think that wraps everything up. I will leave the chat up for a while. Thank you for putting in everybody's contact information, Kaitlyn. This was outstanding, and we'll have this recording edited and web posted soon, and we'll also have each of the presenters' presentations as a PDF that's downloadable. Well, thank you for joining us, everybody. Again, encourage you to follow up on Kaitlyn's suggestion to get active with the Trash Monitoring Work Group under the Monitoring Council. And at a minimum, just continue to subscribe to their emails, attend one of their meetings, and we'll have more webinars as part of this series throughout the spring and summer as well. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.